Let's hope that Elon Musk wants to redeem himself. And if Elon Musk does indeed want to redeem himself, a good way for him to do that would be for him to very heavily promote the ideas that are advocated within this video. This video is about wealth. And if the ideas that are advocated within this video were very heavily promoted by the world's richest man, those ideas would be much more likely to come to fruition. Anyway, before I get to the substance of this video, I would like to apologize in advance for the rambling, repetitive, disjointed nature of this video. This video was cobbled together from a bunch of random angry statements that I wrote years ago, and I'm not a very good writer. Nonetheless, although the statements within this video are certainly rambling, repetitive, disjointed, random, and angry, those statements appear to still be true. And that's what's important, so let's get started. This first section is about land, and this is what I have to say about land. Land is existentially important to humanity. It's difficult to overstate the importance of land to humanity. Almost every material thing that humanity needs to survive and to thrive is in some way derived from land. The vast majority of the food that people eat is grown on land. The shelter that people live in is almost exclusively located on land and built with materials derived from land. The medical supplies that people need to stay healthy and alive are derived almost exclusively from land. And even the water that people drink is collected almost exclusively on land. Without land and the things that are derived from land, probably literally everybody in the world would be dead within days, from drowning, freezing, and being eaten by sharks. People should care about the fair distribution of land fantastically much more than they do. People should talk about the fair distribution of land fantastically much more than they do. And most important of all, people should pursue the fair distribution of land fantastically much more than they do. Land is a natural resource like air and sunshine, and if the governments of the world ever privatized air and sunshine so that people had to pay somebody else just to breathe or to open their eyes to see the light, people would probably quickly and violently overthrow their governments. If governments ever privatized air and sunshine, people would probably quickly and violently overthrow their governments because people would probably decide that they were being metaphorically stabbed in the back and that they were being subjected to intolerable injustice by their governments. Nonetheless, some people complacently accept the extraordinary injustice of the world's land distribution without even bothering to ask their governments what makes that distribution fair. People probably subconsciously assume that if the world's land distribution is unjust, then the world's media and/or governments would have said so. But almost nothing could be further from the truth. The world's media and governments are largely controlled by the rich, and some of the rich have little desire to tell the truth about land distribution, because telling the truth would be contrary to their own personal best interests. Some of the rich figured out a long time ago that because land is a finite resource, land distribution is a zero-sum game. And some of the rich figured out a long time ago that if everybody gets an equally valuable share of land, i.e. a fair share of land, then the rich will necessarily have to settle for much less land than the rich want. Therefore, some of the rich have worked diligently and cleverly for several thousand years to trick and intimidate the poor into accepting much less land than the poor deserve. And the suffering that the greed that some of the rich has inflicted on the poor is incalculable. The truth is that every person has the birthright to an equally valuable share of land, just like every person has the birthright to breathe and to open their eyes to see the light without having to pay somebody else. The truth is that although the United States does not legally belong to all Americans, the United States does rightfully belong to all Americans, equally, regardless of the lies told by some politicians, lawyers, and the media. It's important to remember that there's a massive difference between what is legal and what is rightful. And although America's land distribution is legal, it is most assuredly not rightful, and you should most assuredly be very angry about it. You should be angry about America's current land distribution because it's unjust, but you should also be angry about it because America's current land distribution is very highly destructive. America's current land distribution is very highly destructive because it relegates huge numbers of people to poverty. Some of America's laws were written by unjust people, so no one should be surprised that some of America's laws are unjust. The truth is that all Americans have a birthright to an equally valuable share of America's land. Some Americans complacently work like slaves and pay dearly for almost their entire lives just to be allowed to live on land temporarily, not even to buy the land. Some Americans fail to ask themselves why they should be allowed to breathe for free and to open their eyes to see the sunlight for free, yet have to work like slaves for almost their entire lives just to rent a place to lay down and sleep through the night. Some Americans fail to ask themselves why cockroaches, termites, and maggots are allowed to occupy space for free, but Americans are not. Some Americans complacently accept being treated worse than cockroaches, termites, and maggots without so much as a word of protest. Buying or inheriting a thing may give you legal ownership of that thing, but certainly not rightful ownership. For instance, there was once a time when people legally bought and inherited other people, but there was never a time when people rightfully bought and inherited other people. America's landowners bought and inherited America's land from people who had no right to sell or bequeath America's land, because those earlier owners had no right to anything more than an equally valuable share. Some Americans don't care much about this issue and don't think much about this issue because the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the media, the church, the schools, and celebrities didn't tell the American people to care about it or think about it. And some Americans simply don't care about or think about issues that the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the media, the church, the schools, and celebrities didn't tell them to care about or think about. The United States treated Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy better than it treats the homeless. There are some injustices in this world that have become so normalized that they are simply accepted as settled issues. But those injustices should never have been accepted, and those injustices should be thoroughly unsettled now. And the manner in which the world's land is distributed is at or near the absolute pinnacle of those injustices. During the early days of the abolition movement, there were probably pro-slavery people saying something like this to abolitionists. Slavery is already a settled issue. But abolitionists didn't listen to those pro-slavers, and abolitionists decided to unsettle the issue. Likewise, people today should not listen to anyone who claims that land distribution is already a settled issue, and people today should thoroughly unsettle the issue of land distribution. America's current land distribution is similar to armed robbery, except with the added crime of deliberate deception. Generally, muggers at least have the decency not to try to gaslight you into believing that they're mugging you in the best interests of the American people. The simplest plausible explanation for the current state of America's land distribution is that the current state of America's land distribution was implemented by unjust, corrupt, preferential people for unjust, corrupt, preferential reasons. The simplest plausible explanation is usually the correct one. Unfortunately, as with many other things, a monkey see, monkey do mentality wherein people simply ape what other people are doing motivates some people's attitude toward land distribution. Some people look around at each other and notice that those other people don't seem especially concerned about whether or not America's land distribution is just. And so some people make the very badly mistaken assumption that if America's land distribution was unjust, then other people would have alerted them to that fact. The proper purpose The proper purpose of the government is to serve all Americans as equally as feasible. If the government is doing anything other than serving all Americans as equally as feasible, then the government is failing. The proper purpose of America's laws is to serve all Americans as equally as feasible. If America's laws are doing anything other than serving all Americans as equally as feasible, then America's laws are failing. The laws that govern America's land distribution should serve all Americans as equally as feasible. If the laws that govern America's land distribution are not serving all Americans as equally as feasible, then the laws that govern America's land distribution are failing. The United States is literally made of land. The proper purpose of the United States is to serve all Americans as equally as feasible. So all Americans should receive an equally valuable share of the land that constitutes the United States. Unfortunately, the government will literally kill Americans to keep Americans from claiming their birthright to an equally valuable share of America's land, because there are some in the government who are outright traitorous to the American people. Withholding something that rightfully belongs to someone else is at least as wrong as stealing it. Therefore, the fact that the government is withholding the American people's land from the American people is at least as wrong as if the government was stealing that land from the American people. And it's very well worth noting that if the American people withheld and or stole land from the government would kill the American people. All right, moving on. This next section is about money creation and distribution, and I should forewarn you, it's pretty long. Yeah, it's and a little repetitive, but it's still good. It's still interesting. But make of that what you will. All right, moving on. This next section is about money creation and distribution. And here's what I have to say. The manner in which money is created and distributed in the United States and throughout much of the rest of the world is almost purely unjust. And the unjust manner in which money is created and distributed in the United States and throughout much of the rest of the world is very deliberately and very studiously hidden from the American people. If you ever ask simple, direct questions about the manner in which money is created and distributed in the United States, you will almost certainly have a mind-bogglingly and infuriatingly difficult time getting simple, direct answers to your questions. And no, I am not even slightly exaggerating, and no, I am not even being slightly melodramatic. If you've never tried to get simple, direct answers to simple, direct questions about the creation and distribution of money yourself, then you almost certainly wouldn't believe how difficult it is to get simple, direct answers. Nonetheless, despite how mind-bogglingly exasperating it is to try to get simple, direct answers, I have tried to get simple, direct answers to the following two questions. Who creates and distributes money, and how is money created and distributed? And the simple, direct answer to who creates and distributes money is created and distributed by authorized lending institutions. The police don't want you to know that. Okay, let's go back. Where was I? Okay. And the simple, direct answer to who creates and distributes money is created and distributed by authorized lending institutions. For instance, banks, credit unions, and savings and loans. And the simple, direct answer to how money is created and distributed is money is created and distributed by the act of lending money. Here's an example to illustrate how it works. If you go to a bank to borrow money to buy a house and the bank approves your loan, you might assume that the bank will be lending you money that already exists, but you couldn't be more wrong. The vast majority and probably all of the money that the bank will be lending you is money that the bank will probably be creating right there on the spot. And yes, banks are definitely legally allowed to create brand new money. In fact, the vast majority of new money created in the United States is created by authorized lending institutions. There's a common misconception that American money is printed and minted by the United States Treasury. But the bills and coins that are printed and minted by the Treasury are actually just physical currency, i.e., symbolic physical representations of money. The truth is that physical currency constitutes only a small fraction of all existing money. Most money has no physical form at all. Most money only exists as bookkeeping entries. And bookkeeping entries are extraordinarily important in the creation and distribution of money because banks are legally allowed to create mind-boggling sums of money simply by making very quick bookkeeping entries. It's very important to understand that banks are legally allowed to create billions of dollars within seconds. Banks are legally allowed to create billions of dollars in less time than it took me to speak this sentence. Banks are legally allowed to create billions of dollars in exactly the amount of time that it takes to make a simple bookkeeping entry. And it's precisely because banks are legally allowed to create and distribute mind-boggling sums of money with so ridiculously little effort that the creation and distribution of money is so unjust. If you go to a bank to borrow money to buy a house and your loan is approved, you will probably have to work like a slave for decades to pay back the money that you borrowed. Worse still, you will have to pay massive interest, penalties, and fees along with the principal. Worse still, if you miss too many payments, the bank will foreclose on your house. Worse still, the money that you're working like a slave for decades to pay back, along with massive interest, penalties, and fees, was almost certainly created in a matter of seconds by making a simple bookkeeping entry. But worst of all, some bankers expect you to thank them for the money that it only takes them seconds to create and that you have to pay back along with massive interest, penalties, and fees. Slave masters in the Old South at least had the decency not to expect their slaves to be grateful for being enslaved, but some bankers expect you to be grateful while they rape you for decades. It's obviously mind-bogglingly unjust that you have to work like a slave for decades to pay back money that it only took a bank seconds to create, and that you also have to work like a slave for decades to pay the bank massive interest, penalties, and fees on the money that it only took the bank seconds to create. Comparatively, proportionally, the amount of labor that banks put into creating and distributing money is like a tiny drop of water, but the amount of labor that the American people put into paying back that money and the amount of labor that the American people put into paying the bank's massive interest, penalties, and fees is like every ocean in the world combined. The disparity in the labor expected from banks versus the labor expected from the American people is mind-bogglingly unjust. What the banks are doing may not what the banks are doing may not technically be slavery, but in at least one way it's worse than slavery. Slaves at least are made to fully understand that they're being exploited. But when people borrow money, they're made to believe that the banks are actually doing those people a favor and that those people should be grateful. Imagine if you went to McDonald's and ordered a cup of coffee and the cashier said, "Okay, your total today will be $500,000. In that scenario, you would probably be dumbfounded that McDonald's would dare to charge you so outlandishly much money for doing so pathetically little labor. So you should also be dumbfounded that banks charge so outlandishly much money for doing so pathetically little labor. And you should be even more dumbfounded that banks are legally allowed to charge so outlandishly much money for doing so little labor, and that their unconscionably unjust behavior receives so little public scrutiny. And the reason that banks are allowed to charge so outlandishly much money for doing so little labor is that some of the people who owned the banks paid off America's elected officials to create the injustice that is America's money creation and distribution system. And some of the people who owned the banks continue to pay off America's elected officials to keep that injustice legal. It's important to understand that banks and other authorized lending institutions are components of the financial services industry. Sorry, got a burp. Oh, guess I'll hold it. And the financial services industry is the largest special interest campaign contributor to America's elected officials. And many of, and many of America's elected officials have come very close. And many of America's elected officials have very close personal relationships or are trying to cultivate very close personal relationships with the financial services industry above and beyond simple campaign donations. And even when individual elected officials don't have close personal relationships with the financial services industry, those elected officials very rarely dare to anger the financial services industry because the financial services industry has very close relationships with both the Democratic and Republican parties, parties upon which practically every elected official depends for their job. So, for elected officials, opposing the financial services industry would be very much tantamount to biting the hand that feeds them. I will be back shortly. I'm back. Did you miss me? Where was I? Okay. It's no coincidence that elected officials like AOC, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders, who absurdly purport themselves to be economic justice crusaders, speak so little about the injustice of money creation and distribution in the United States. Those elected officials know which side their bread is buttered on, and their so-called crusade is nothing more than crass political theater. Furthermore, it's interesting to note that a campaign contribution from a special interest donor is usually a monetary donation given to solicit favorable treatment. And a monetary donation given to solicit favorable treatment is also the definition of a bribe. Special interest donors and elected officials don't call special interest campaign contributions bribes. But a dead fish by any other name still smells just as fishy. And regardless of whatever special interest campaign contributions are called, those contributions always smell fishy. America's money creation and distribution system is a massive kickback scheme. Elected officials authorize lending institutions to create and distribute massive amounts of money. Then those authorized lending institutions do indeed create and distribute massive amounts of money. Then those authorized lending institutions reap massive profits from the massive interest penalties and fees that those authorized lending institutions charge. Then some of the people associated with those authorized lending institutions kick back some of their profits to elected officials through campaign contributions, providing employment, and probably providing insider information. America's various levels of government, federal, state, and local, are not the only components of the United States that is very heavily corrupted by some of the people associated with the financial services industry. The mainstream media is also very heavily corrupted by some of the people associated with the financial services industry. In fact, the primary reason that the injustice of America's money creation and distribution system receives so little public scrutiny is probably that the mainstream media is largely owned by many of the same people who own the financial services industry itself. And the mainstream media receives much of its revenue from financial services industry advertising. And the mainstream media also receives much of its revenue from advertisers that are owned by many of the same people who own the financial services industry itself. So, for the mainstream media, reporting the full truth about the injustice of America's money creation and distribution system would be very much tantamount to biting the hand that feeds them. And it's incredibly unjust that the mainstream media so studiously avoids reporting on the injustice of America's and the world's money creation and distribution system because that system has such a profoundly detrimental effect on the American people and the world's people. And it's incredibly absurd that the mainstream media so studiously avoids reporting on the injustice of that system because the injustice of that system is a monumentally important story. In fact, although I know that people would laugh at me for making such an overwrought assertion, I'm absolutely convinced that the injustice of the world's money creation and distribution system is much more important to the course of world history than World War II ever was. I say that because people very commonly work like slaves for almost their entire lives for money. People very commonly kill and die for money. People very commonly forfeit their souls for money. People very commonly sacrifice their happiness for money. People very commonly sacrifice other people's happiness for money. People very commonly sacrifice their health for money. People very commonly sacrifice other people's health for money. People very commonly destroy their own families for money. People very commonly destroy other people's families for money. And entire nations very commonly rise or fall because of money. And the world's shockingly unjust money creation and distribution system is where money comes from. It's also very well worth noting that several thousand children die every 24 hours due to poverty, which means that those children's families had insufficient money to keep those children alive. In fact, it's a practical certainty that fantastically far more children have died from poverty since the end of World War II than the total number of people who died in World War II itself. And the world's shockingly unjust money creation and distribution system is largely responsible for those children's poverty and consequently those children's deaths. By the way, you should be very suspicious that the media talks much more about World War II than about the world's money creation and distribution system, especially being that World War II ended going on a century ago. In fact, the media talks much more about Kardashians than the media talks about the world's money creation and distribution system. It's important to understand that the people who create money are also the people who get to decide which people will receive money, for what purposes those people will receive money, and under what terms those people will receive money. Banks have almost godlike power over the American people, and yet the media very studiously ignores that colossally important story and instead reports on who got tossed from The Masked Singer, The Bachelor, American Idol, and Survivor. The way that money is created and distributed is a massive con game, and the media is in on the con. And the first rule of running a successful con game is don't tell the mark that they're being conned. So, of course, the media is not going to tell the American people, the mark, that they're being conned. And it's not just the media or the government that's conning the American people. The worst culprits are, of course, some of the people associated with the financial services industry. And if you've never had the unique displeasure of dealing with such people yourself, then you probably wouldn't even believe how slippery those people can be. Therefore, I'm going to tell you some of the behaviors that you should expect to encounter if you ever try to get simple, direct answers from those people about America's money creation and distribution system. Firstly, you should expect to either be completely ignored or given very curt, brush-off responses that don't actually answer your questions. Secondly, you should expect the runaround. You should expect to be told, "That's not my department. Have you tried asking so-and-so?" Then when you ask so-and-so, you should expect so-and-so to say, "That's not my department." And you should also expect so-and-so to suggest that you ask whoever it was that suggested that you ask so-and-so to begin with. Thirdly, you should expect feigned indignation. You should expect people to pretend to be offended that you're asking questions, because the people who are feigning indignation will then have an excuse to cease communicating with you. Fourthly, you should expect to be told, "I don't have time for this," which is an absurd excuse. The truth is that giving people simple, direct answers to simple, direct questions is not time-consuming. Fifthly, you should expect to be directed toward deliberately confusing information. You should expect to be directed toward a lot of irrelevant, extraneous, confusing minutia that doesn't answer your questions. And the reason that some people in the financial services industry will direct you toward a lot of useless information is that those people want you to become so exasperated that you finally just give up and stop trying to get answers. Sixthly, You should expect that it will be heavily implied that if you don't understand the gibberish responses that you'll be given, it's because you're too stupid to understand those gibberish responses. And the reason that it will be heavily implied that you're too stupid to understand the gibberish responses that you'll be given is so that you'll feel too embarrassed to continue searching for answers and just give up. But you should always remember that it's actually stupid not to proofread this stuff before you do it. Anyway, but you should always remember that what's actually stupid is to let extraordinarily unjust con artists convince you that smart questions are stupid questions and that their BS brush-off responses are actually good faith answers, and that you should be embarrassed that you don't already know the information that those con artists are deliberately and relentlessly trying to hide from you. Seventhly, you should expect to be told that you should not fall for the so-called conspiracy theory that alleges that America's money creation and distribution system is unjust. And out of all of the things that you'll be told, that is the most ridiculous thing that you'll be told, and it's also an outlandish lie. It's important to understand that if a narrative is factual, then that narrative is not theoretical. And if a narrative is not theoretical, then that narrative cannot possibly be a conspiracy theory. Therefore, it's very well worth noting that it is a fact that the vast majority of the money that is created in the United States is created by privately owned lending institutions, e.g. banks, credit unions, and savings and loans. And it is a fact that lending institutions put fantastically much less labor into creating money than borrowers put into paying back that money. And it is a fact that, along with the principal, borrowers also have to pay lending institutions massive interest penalties and fees. And it is a fact that lending institutions reap extraordinary profits from the interest penalties and fees that those lending institutions charge borrowers for borrowing money that those lending institutions put almost no effort into creating. And it is a fact that extraordinarily many Americans and extraordinarily many American families have been destroyed by the actions that those Americans had to take and by the sacrifices that they had to make in order to pay back the money plus massive interest penalties and fees that lending institutions created in mere seconds by simply making bookkeeping entries. And it is a fact that if people go to hell for being liars, then those people who claim that the injustice of America's money creation and distribution system is a conspiracy theory should probably be very afraid of hell. Some people within the financial services industry, the government, and the media promote the idea that if you believe in conspiracies, for instance, if you believe that America's money creation and distribution system is a conspiracy to make already rich moneylenders even richer at the expense of the American people, then you're crazy. But it's quite the contrary. If you don't believe in conspiracies, but instead believe that the world is as it's portrayed to you, then you're crazy. Some people within the financial services industry, the government, and the media pretend that the fact that money creation and distribution is so fantastically profitable for the financial services industry is simply an innocent peripheral side effect of that system. But the truth is that profiting the financial services industry is the absolute central purpose of that system. Anyway, unfortunately, calling the injustice of America's money creation and distribution system a conspiracy theory is very far from the only misleading statement that some people within the financial services industry are likely to make. Some people in the financial services industry will probably claim that America's money creation and distribution system is perfectly innocent because lending institutions are not allowed to keep the money that those institutions created when that money gets paid back to those institutions. But the people who will make that claim will very studiously avoid admitting to the fact that lending institutions are definitely allowed to keep the massive profits that those institutions reap by charging massive interest penalties and fees. Some people in the financial services industry will probably also make the absurd claim that the reason that lending institutions charge so outlandishly much money for doing so ridiculously little labor is that those institutions are accepting terrible risks. But that's an absurd lie. Lending institutions very dramatically limit their risks by holding title to collateral, e.g. homes, cars, and businesses. Some people in the financial services industry don't want you to know that it's actually borrowers and America's taxpayers, who sometimes have to bail out the financial services industry, who are taking terrible risks, not the financial services industry itself. Another way that some people in the financial services industry mislead the American people is by doing something incredibly underhanded. Specifically, some people in the financial services industry very deliberately and very studiously avoid naming the method by which lending institutions create money. And no, I'm not joking or exaggerating about this. If you've never tried yourself to find out what to call the method by which lending institutions create and distribute money, you would probably be shocked at how hard it is to find the name for that method. The closest thing to a commonly used name for the method by which lending institutions create and distribute money is the term money multiplier. But even the term money multiplier is far from universally accepted. Ultimately, there appears to be no proper standard name for the method by which lending institutions create and distribute money, and that is monumentally suspicious. It's monumentally suspicious that the method by which lending institutions create and distribute money, a method that is more important to the course of world history than World War II, appears to have no proper standard name. It's monumentally suspicious that every one of the Kardashians has a proper standard name, but that something that's more important to the course of world history than World War II does not have a proper standard name. And there are probably two primary reasons why the method that lending institutions use to create and distribute money does not have a proper standard name. The first of the two reasons is probably that things that have no names are much more difficult to discuss than things that do have names. And things that are difficult to discuss are rarely discussed at all, because it's very frustrating and time-consuming to try to do so. And it's very useful to some people in the financial services industry that it's so frustrating and time-consuming to discuss the method that lending institutions use to create and distribute money, because less discussion equates to fewer people knowing how unjust that system is. And the fewer people who know how unjust that system is, the safer that system is. Anyway, the second of the two reasons why the method that lending institutions use to create and distribute money does not have a proper standard name is probably that it's harder to research things that have no names than things that do have names. No, I cannot speak. Let's try this again. Anyway, the second of the two reasons why the method that the lending institutions use to create and distribute money does not have a proper standard name is probably that it's much harder to research things that have no names than things that do have names. For instance, if you want to research a specific Kardashian, you can very simply type their specific name into a search engine and quickly be inundated with information. But if you want to research the method by which lending institutions create and distribute money, you'll very quickly discover that that's much harder to do without a proper standard name. And it's very useful to some people in the financial services industry that it's so frustrating and time-consuming to research that method, because that frustration and time consumption causes people to give up trying to do any research. And if people can be convinced to stop trying to research the system, people are much more likely to give up trying to reform the system. By the way, if you do want to do research on the method by which lending institutions create and distribute money, you'll probably get the best results by typing money multiplier into a search engine. But be forewarned that even those results will probably be highly unsatisfactory. Anyway, moving on, if you're somebody who cares what the Bible says, you might be interested to know that what the banks are doing is called usury. And usury is vehemently and repeatedly condemned in the Bible. You might also be interested to know that despite any lies that you might be told to the contrary, usury is by far the largest industry in the world. The money that is created on the spot by the world's authorized lending institutions far exceeds the monetary value of the goods and services created by any other industry in the world. The next closest industry ain't even close to being close. Americans should be much angrier about money creation and distribution than Americans ever were about the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Americans should be much angrier about America's money creation and distribution system because that system has a fantastically much more detrimental effect on Americans' lives than 9/11 ever did, and because that system is far more insidious and underhanded than what happened on 9/11. Unlike some of America's moneylenders, Al-Qaeda at least had the decency not to pretend that Al-Qaeda was working toward America's benefit and that Americans should be grateful to Al-Qaeda. Some Americans don't care much about money creation and distribution and don't think much about the issue because the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the media, the church, the schools, and celebrities didn't tell the American people to care about it or think about it. And some Americans, unfortunately, simply don't care about or think about issues that the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the media, the church, the schools, and celebrities didn't tell them to care about or think about. Some of the people within the financial services industry, the government, and the media are like chomos who say to the American people, we're going to play a really fun touching game, but this is a secret touching game, so we never talk about it with anybody else, okay? And some of the American people are like idiot children who refuse to believe that they're being victimized and who angrily defend their abusers. On the rare occasion that it's mentioned at all, America's money creation and distribution system is treated as a minor esoteric issue that's been badly misrepresented by conspiracy theorists. But the creation and distribution of several $1 trillion every year is no minor esoteric issue. It's an extremely important issue with life and death consequences for billions of people. And it's no misrepresentation to say that privately owned lending institutions, e.g. banks, are legally allowed to create several $1 trillion every year. And I need to stop right there momentarily, and I will be right back. Okay, and it's no misrepresentation to say that the owners of those lending institutions profit very handsomely from America's money creation and distribution system, while doing almost no work to obtain those profits, and that the people who borrow money often have to work like slaves for decades to pay back that money plus massive interest, penalties, and fees. It's a huge red flag that something as monumentally important as money creation and distribution receives so little attention. It's a huge red flag that something as monumentally important as money creation and distribution receives so little attention, and that some of the people behind it make no good faith effort to explain it. If you don't understand a thing and the people behind it make no good faith effort to explain it, even though it has a very profound effect on your life, then you certainly should not support that thing. In fact, you should almost certainly oppose it, at least until the people behind it make a good faith effort to explain it to you. Some people try to convince you that you're stupid if you ask questions, or that you're stupid if you don't automatically agree with them. But such people are just gaslighting you. You're actually stupid if you don't ask questions, and if you do automatically agree with people. It's common for some people involved in money creation and distribution to talk a lot about technical minutia, because those people want to distract Americans away from the big picture by focusing Americans' attention on several smaller pictures. Those people also talk a lot about technical minutia because they want Americans to be confused. And those people want Americans to be confused because When people are confused, they don't know what to do. And when people don't know what to do, they usually do nothing, which is precisely what those people want Americans to do. Some people involved in money creation and distribution also talk a lot about technical minutia in order to reinforce the idea that those people really understand what they're talking about, thereby reinforcing the idea that Americans should listen to those people instead of the people who oppose the system. Some people involved in money creation and distribution also want people to be confused about the system because when people are confused, they often want to be told what to do. Thereby, the people involved in money creation and distribution can simply tell people to trust the system. And unfortunately, some Americans do just that. If a thing looks and smells like BS, the vast majority of the time, it's BS. The vast majority of the time, if somebody seems like they're hiding something, they are. Some of the people involved in money creation and distribution are clever. If you're not careful, they'll convince you that fantasy is reality, that reality is fantasy, that what's bad for you is good for you, that what's good for you is bad for you, that people who are trying to hurt you are trying to help you, and that people who are trying to help you are trying to hurt you. After World War II, the remnants of the SS claimed that there never was a Holocaust, and the SS claimed accurately that SS personnel were by far the world's foremost experts on the subject. But the Allies wisely refused to be dissuaded by SS gaslighting. Likewise, people today should never be dissuaded by the gaslighting of some of the people in the financial services industry. People today should not accept those people's assurances that all is well simply because those people can honestly say that they know more about money creation and distribution than anybody else. And people today should recognize that they're being subjected to an atrocity that has caused fantastically far more suffering than the Holocaust ever did. Some Americans look at people working in the financial services industry and think to themselves something like this: those people seem pretty smart. They seem to know what they're doing. And those Americans are correct. People working in the financial services industry are smart and competent. Some of them are, in fact, among the best con artists in history. They're so good at conning people that they can rob you without even touching your money through inflation. They're so good that they rob you even when they are sleeping. They loan you money that they metaphorically pull right out of their a-holes, then they get you to slave your entire life away to pay them back that money plus massive interest, penalties, and fees, and then they get you to thank them for it. They've got a lot of Americans thinking that money lenders are doing Americans a favor. Some people working in the financial services industry practice a very disciplined form of omerta. They absolutely will not admit that privately owned lending institutions, e.g. banks, are creating massive amounts of money while doing no more work than making a bookkeeping entry, and then lending that money to the American people and forcing Americans to pay back that money that the money lenders put almost no work into creating, and also forcing Americans to pay massive interest, penalties, and fees on top of the principal, and returning massive profits for the owners of those lending institutions, even though those institutions did almost no work to create the money that they lent, because then the American people would recognize that it's shockingly unjust for the American people to have to work like slaves for decades to pay back money plus massive interest, penalties, and fees that it only took a bank seconds to create. If you criticize the financial services industry, some within that industry claim that you don't know what you're talking about. But they very conspicuously neglect to mention the fact that if you don't know what you're talking about, it's because some of the financial services industry is so deliberately opaque. I did not emphasize that correctly. But they very conspicuously neglect to mention the fact that if you don't know what you're talking about, it's because some of the financial services industry is so deliberately opaque. There we go. They don't want you to know what you're talking about. The financial services industry could very easily launch a transparency website wherein they could list all of the institutions that are allowed to create US dollars and how many US dollars each institution creates and how much each institution institution profits from the US dollars that it creates. But the financial services industry established no such website and almost certainly never will. Lending institutions should be required by law to tell borrowers exactly how those institutions acquired every penny that they lend to those borrowers. The American people should be made aware that the manner in which money is created and distributed in the United States often leads to rampant inflation, which often has severe detrimental effects on the American people. If moneylenders with government complicity devalue the US dollar such that you must spend $5,000 more to provide for yourself and your family this year than you did last year, then those moneylenders have swindled you out of $5,000 just this year alone. Forcing people to spend more money is just as wrong as outright stealing their money. US dollars have practically no intrinsic value of their own. For instance, it would be unwise to eat US dollars, and US dollars don't do a good job of keeping the rain off of your head. US dollars are valuable almost exclusively because they enable you to buy goods and services that do have intrinsic value. That is to say that US dollars give you purchasing power, and the way that money is created and distributed in the United States creates inflation which dramatically diminishes your purchasing power. Unjustly diminishing people's purchasing power, which is what very commonly happens in the United States, is just as wrong and destructive as outright stealing people's money. Some money lenders are clever. They don't overtly steal your money because you notice that. Instead, they steal your purchasing power. They steal the value from your money rather than stealing the money itself. If the financial services industry was acting purely in good faith, then they would have told you everything that I'm telling you themselves. People very commonly work like slaves for almost their entire lives for money. People very commonly kill and die for money. People very commonly forfeit their souls for money. People very commonly sacrifice their happiness for money. People very commonly sacrifice other people's happiness for money. People very commonly sacrifice their health for money. People very commonly sacrifice other people's health for money. People very commonly destroy their own families for money. People very commonly destroy other people's families for money. And entire nations very commonly rise and fall because of money. Money is monumentally important, and yet some people have very little curiosity about where money comes from and how money is distributed. It's completely insane that some people have so little interest in such a monumentally important subject, but it's not a coincidence that some people have so little interest in where money comes from and how money is distributed. The reason that some people have so little interest in the creation and distribution of money is that some people in the financial services industry, the government, and the media very deliberately condition people to believe that there's nothing to see here and that you should just move along. But if there's nothing to see here, it's only because some people in the financial services industry, the government, and the media are deliberately hiding it from you. Some people in the financial services industry, the government, and the media deliberately promote the belief that only fringe weirdos ask questions about the creation and distribution of money. And some people in the financial services industry, the government, and the media deliberately promote the belief that only the looniest of the lunatic fringe questions the justice of money creation and distribution. But the truth is that it's only the dumbest of the dumb who fail to question the justice of money creation and distribution. Liars will tell you that there's no nefarious motive behind America's money creation and distribution system. But the truth is that there's nothing but nefarious motive behind America's money creation and distribution system. Unfortunately, as with many other things, a monkey see, monkey do mentality wherein people simply ape what other people are doing motivates some people's attitude toward money creation and distribution. Some people look around at each other and notice that other people don't seem especially concerned about whether or not America's money creation and distribution system is just. And so some people make the very badly mistaken assumption that if America's money creation and distribution system was unjust, then somebody would have alerted them to that fact. And by the way, I'm doing that right now, but whatever. The simplest plausible explanation for America's money creation and distribution system is that that system was created and implemented by unjust, corrupt, preferential people for unjust, corrupt, preferential reasons. The simplest plausible explanation is usually the correct one. The greatest defense that the people who create money have against reform is the fact that America's money creation and distribution system is so insane that you cannot accurately explain it without sounding insane yourself. That is to say that it is wholly accurate to say that authorized lending institutions are legally allowed to create vast sums of money by making quick, simple bookkeeping entries, and borrowers commonly have to work like slaves for decades to pay back that money plus massive interest, penalties, and fees. And lending institutions reap massive profits from doing shockingly little work. And the astonishing injustice of the world's money creation and distribution system is more important to the course of world history than World War II. And there is a very vast, multifarious, highly disciplined, and very successful conspiracy of silence perpetrated by some people associated with the financial services industry, the government, and the media that is deliberately keeping the public ignorant of the astonishing injustice of the world's money creation and distribution system. And something I forgot to mention here is that they also deliberately neglect to name the method by which they create and distribute money, which also sounds crazy, and yet it's true. But anyway, back to what I was saying. When you describe the world's money creation and distribution system accurately, like I just did in the preceding statement, you sound insane. You sound like a profoundly delusional paranoiac. When you describe the world's money creation and distribution system accurately, you sound like a hack screenwriter who is describing the premise to a bad movie script that you're trying to shop around. And that's the true genius of the world's money creation and distribution system. That system is so shockingly absurd that you cannot accurately describe it without sounding like a maniac and/or an idiot. And because you end up sounding like a maniac and/or an idiot, people automatically discount what you're saying. Thereby, the world's money creation and distribution system escapes any substantial scrutiny, because people don't listen to the people who are trying to raise the alarm. And because the world's money creation and distribution system escapes any substantial scrutiny, it also escapes any substantial calls for reform. Another reason why the world's money creation and distribution system escapes any substantial calls for reform is paradoxically that that system so desperately deserves to be reformed. That is to say that, oddly enough, it is precisely because the world's money creation and distribution system so desperately deserves to be reformed that it is not being reformed. What I'm trying to say is that that system is so astoundingly unjust and destructive that even many of the people who understand that system live in an utter state of denial about how unjust and destructive that system is. Denial is a coping mechanism, and as a coping mechanism, many of the people who understand the world's money creation and distribution system live in an utter state of denial about how unjust and destructive that system is. And those same people also live in an utter state of denial about their own personal complicity in that astonishingly unjust and destructive system. Many of the people who understand the world's money creation and distribution system cannot emotionally process how unjust and destructive that system is and how complicit they themselves are in the injustice and destruction. So those people simply embrace the system because those people are incapable of coping with how unjust and destructive that system is and with their own personal complicity in any other way. The world's money creation and distribution system is absolutely ingenious because that system is so astonishingly unjust and destructive that it actually engenders a state of denial about how unjust and destructive it is. People cannot accept how unjust and destructive it is, so people simply deny it. There are some injustices in this world that have become so normalized that they are simply accepted as settled issues. But those injustices should never have been accepted, and those injustices Yeah, it got me all worked up. Okay, so there are some injustices in this world that have become so normalized that they are simply accepted as settled issues. But those injustices should never have been accepted, and those injustices should be thoroughly unsettled now. And the manner in which the world's money is created and distributed is at or near the absolute pinnacle of those injustices. During the early days of the abolition movement, there were probably pro-slavery people saying something like this to abolitionists. Slavery is already a settled issue, but abolitionists didn't listen to those pro-slavers, and abolitionists decided to unsettle the issue. Likewise, people today should not listen to anyone who claims that the manner in which money is created and distributed is already a settled issue, and people today should thoroughly unsettle the issue. Withholding something that rightfully belongs to someone else is just as wrong as stealing it. The fact that the government is withholding the American people's money from the American people is just as wrong as if the government was stealing that money from the American people. And it's well worth noting that when Americans withhold and or steal money from the government punishes Americans very severely. All right, moving on. The next thing that I want to talk about is the Federal Reserve. And what I want to say about the Federal Reserve is this. Nobody should be talking about the Federal Reserve. Here's what I mean by that. If you ever research money creation and distribution, you will undoubtedly be inundated with information about the Federal Reserve. And that information is designed to mislead you into believing that the Federal Reserve is absolutely central to money creation and distribution. But the Federal Reserve is actually very peripheral and secondary in the creation and distribution of money. It's very important to always remember and always focus on the fact that authorized lending institutions, for instance banks, create and distribute the very vast majority of money in the United States and throughout the world. Therefore, researching the Federal Reserve is very much a distraction when researching money creation and distribution. In fact, I suspect that the Federal Reserve was literally invented to be a distraction. I suspect that when the Federal Reserve was originally conceived, it was always meant to distract people away from the actions of authorized lending institutions, actions which are far more important than anything that the Federal Reserve does. If you ever study the Federal Reserve, you will quickly discover that studying the Federal Reserve is confusing, boring, and most importantly, time-consuming. And can I just say that saying the words Federal Reserve is also difficult. But anyway, if you ever study the Federal Reserve, you will quickly discover that studying the Federal Reserve is confusing, boring, and most importantly, time-consuming. Studying the Federal Reserve will distract you away from what's important. So don't fall for that trick. Instead, focus on authorized lending institutions. They are what's important. Anyway, moving on. So far I've talked a lot about how things are being done wrong, but now it's time to start talking about how to do things right. So let's get to it. All existing U.S. dollars should be legally invalidated. Then new American money should be created, and all of that new American money should be distributed equally so that every American receives the exact same amount as every other American. And from now on, whenever new American money is created, all of that money should be distributed equally so that every American receives the exact same amount as every other American. Money should be created by governments for the equal benefit of all of their respective citizens. There should be no favoritism. The best way to ensure that all of a nation's citizens benefit equally from the creation of money is for all of those citizens to receive an equal share whenever money is created. So whenever money is created in the United States, every American should receive an equal share of that money. The proper purpose of the government is to serve all Americans as equally as feasible. If the government is doing anything other than serving all Americans as equally as feasible, then the government is failing. The proper purpose of America's laws is to serve all Americans as equally as feasible. If America's laws are doing anything other than serving all Americans as equally as feasible, then America's laws are failing. The laws that govern the creation and distribution of money should serve all Americans as equally as feasible. If the laws that govern the creation and distribution of money are not serving all Americans as equally as feasible, then those laws are failing. Unfortunately, much of the law was written by unjust people, and so no one should be surprised that much of the law is itself unjust. It's also unjust that I have to step away for a quick second, but I'll be back again. Some of the politicians who wrote America's laws were paid off to create the abomination that is America's money creation and distribution system. And some of today's politicians are still paid off to maintain that abomination. The United States government is the American people's government, even though it certainly doesn't act like it. And so the United States government should be regulating the creation and distribution of money in whatever manner serves all Americans as equally as feasible. The best and probably only way of ensuring that all Americans benefit equally from the creation and distribution of money is to ensure that all Americans receive an equal share whenever money is created. Say that again. The best and probably only way of ensuring that all Americans benefit equally from the creation and distribution of money is to ensure that all Americans receive an equal share whenever money is created. The American people are entitled to compensation for the betrayal committed against them. Specifically, the American people are entitled to have all existing money legally invalidated and to have all newly created money distributed equally among them whenever new money is created. The American people should be aware that many of the people who advocate maintaining America's current money creation and distribution system will claim that that system keeps America's economy quote-unquote strong, which is very often not even true. It's very common for America's economy to falter badly under America's current system. But even if America's current system kept America's economy strong all of the time, which it doesn't, maintaining America's current system would still be completely unnecessary, because if all Americans received an equal share whenever new money was created, Americans would almost certainly spend, lend, invest, and donate most of that money, which would almost certainly stimulate America's economy at least as well and probably better than America's current system. Even if there was no better way to strengthen America's economy than to maintain America's current system, which is an absurd proposition, the way that America's money is created and distributed now is still a bad thing. Strengthening America's economy at the expense of the American people is very obviously a bad thing. By way of analogy, the reinstitution of slavery and the extermination of America's old and handicapped, and forcing women to engage in selective breeding would probably all strengthen America's economy. But that doesn't mean that those are good ideas. And ultimately, nobody should want to strengthen America's economy if America's economy is working against the best interests of the American people. If America's economy is working against the best interests of the American people, then everybody should want America's economy to get weaker, not stronger. What's good for America's economy is not necessarily good for the American people. America's economy is not a living, sentient, or feeling thing. Therefore, America's economy cannot possibly die or be hurt in any meaningful way whatsoever. And even if America's economy was completely destroyed, America's economy would not notice or care. But the American people can be hurt and die in meaningful ways. So people should obviously care much more about what's good for the American people than what's good for the American economy. The American people should be aware that on the very rare occasion that you can get proponents of America's current money creation and distribution system to even talk about that system, those proponents will invariably try to steer the conversation toward how America's current system is allegedly good for America's economy. But those proponents very studiously avoid talking about whether or not America's current system is fair, because America's current system is so shockingly and obviously unfair that not even the slickest PR flack could spin it in a way that would make it sound fair. So again, all existing US dollars should be legally invalidated, and new American money should be created, and all of that new American money should be distributed equally among all Americans, and from now on, whenever new money is created, it should all be distributed equally among all Americans, full stop. All right, moving on. In this section, I'm going to be talking briefly about tangible property, and this is what I have to say. The vast majority of manufactured tangible property that exists in the United States was manufactured with natural resources that were unjustly withheld from the American people and used without the American people's permission in order to manufacture that tangible property. And the vast majority of manufactured tangible property that exists in the United States was also bought with money that was unjustly withheld from the American people and used without the American people's permission to buy that manufactured tangible property. Therefore, the American people should each get an equally valuable share of the tangible property that was manufactured with the natural resources that were unjustly withheld from the American people and used without the American people's permission, and an equally valuable share of the manufactured tangible property that was also bought with the money that was unjustly withheld from the American people and used without the American people's permission. As such, all manufactured tangible property in the United States should be redistributed so that every American receives an equally valuable share. Ultimately, all tangible property, including tangible property that was manufactured from natural resources and tangible property which simply is a natural resource in and of itself, should be redistributed so that all Americans receive an equally valuable share. All right, moving on. In this section and the sections to follow, I'm going to be talking about multiple different things. But before I do, I want to clarify that, just like with the preceding sections of this video, I wrote the following sections years ago. So, although I believe that the information that I'll be sharing in the following sections was accurate at the time that I wrote them, they're obviously out of date now. However, the fundamental principles that I'll be talking about are still just as valid today as they were back then. So let's get started. As of this writing, the United States government debt is approximately $31 trillion. By the way, I believe it's actually around 37 trillion when I'm making this video, but that's secondary. All right. As of this writing, the United States government debt is approximately $31 trillion. America's individual states have a cumulative debt of approximately $2.5 trillion. America's individual municipalities have a cumulative bond debt of approximately $4 trillion. America's cumulative business debt is approximately $15.5 trillion, and America's cumulative household debt is approximately $16.15 trillion. Those numbers, when added together, amount to almost $70 trillion. And those numbers are, if anything, probably low. And those numbers almost certainly don't reflect all of the debt in the United States. Therefore, America's debt situation is almost certainly even worse than I'm making it sound. And those facts make the next number that I'm going to share with you all the more shocking. Specifically, as of this writing, the total number of US dollars in existence everywhere in the entire world is approximately 21.2 trillion. And 70 trillion is obviously more than 3 times as big as 21.2 trillion. Therefore, the amount of money that's owed in the United States is more than 3 times as big as the total number of US dollars in existence. That's extraordinarily important because it indicates that even if literally no person, business, nonprofit, or government entity in the entire world spent even a single US dollar on anything for themselves, including the food that they need to survive, and literally every person, business, nonprofit, and government entity in the entire world used every single US dollar in existence to pay off America's debts, all of that money would not even cover a third of America's debts. America's total debt would still be staggering even if every single US dollar in existence was used to pay America's debts. The only possible way to pay off all existing debt in the United States is to create staggering amounts of new money. And the only realistic way to create all of the new money necessary to pay off all of that debt under the present system is to create staggering amounts of new debt. The vast majority of money created in the United States is created when lending institutions lend money, which is obviously creating more debt. Money creation in the United States is deliberately designed to keep people in permanent, inescapable debt so that money lenders make lots of money off of the American people's misery. And money creation in the United States is designed to ensure that even if you don't borrow money yourself, you still have to pay off the government's debts. All current debt should be legally invalidated because the American people have been borrowing money that already rightfully, if not legally, belonged to the American people and that was unjustly withheld from the American people. Ultimately, the American people should demand a national referendum to decide whether or not the American people will each receive an equally valuable share of America's land and an equally valuable share of America's other tangible property, and whether or not all existing American money will be legally invalidated, and whether or not new money will be created, and whether or not all of that new money will be distributed equally to all Americans, and whether or not all Americans will receive an equal share whenever new money is created, and whether or not all existing debt will be canceled. If every American received an equally valuable share of America's land and an equally valuable share of America's other tangible property, and all existing American money and all existing debt were legally invalidated, and new money was created and distributed so that every American received an equal share of that new money, then every American would finally be starting out on a level playing field. And if every American was starting out on a level playing field, then every American would finally be treated the same as every other American. And if every American was finally treated the same as every other American, then every American would finally have justice. And on that point, it's very interesting to note that in the United States in 2020, the closest year for which I could easily find statistics, the median household net worth was $121,411. But the average household net worth was $746,821. And $746,821 is over 6 times as large as $121,411. The reason that those numbers are so interesting is that those numbers indicate that if every American finally started out on a level playing field, i.e. every American finally received justice, then half of American households would be more than 6 times as rich as they are right now. Yes, you heard that right. If every American finally started out on a level playing field, then half of American households would be more than 6 times as rich as they are right now. But wait, that ain't all the good news, there's more. If every American finally started out on a level playing field, then the poorest Americans would be fantastically much more than 6 times as rich as they are right now. And if every American finally started out on a level playing field, then 84% of American households would be richer than they are right now, because 84% of American households currently have a net worth below the average of $746,821. All right, moving on. In this section, I'll be talking about how the American people are near slaves. And this is what I have to say. Slaves who don't understand that they're slaves are the best kind of slaves. And so Americans are very nearly the best kind of slaves because Americans don't understand that they're very nearly slaves. Americans don't understand that they're very nearly slaves because Americans are very deliberately and very routinely tricked into believing that Americans are working primarily for their own benefit. Yet, unbeknownst to most Americans are actually working primarily to make a bunch of already very rich people even richer than they already are. Most Americans fail to adequately comprehend that when Americans work like slaves, it makes the entities that those Americans directly work for and the entities that those Americans indirectly work for much more valuable. And because the entities for whom the American people work, both directly and indirectly, dramatically increase in value when Americans work like slaves, the people who own those entities, the rich, get dramatically richer when Americans work like slaves. Most Americans fail to adequately comprehend that the American people only receive a fraction of the money that their labor produces. And most Americans fail to adequately comprehend that in order to be able to Most Americans fail to adequately comprehend that the American people only receive a fraction of the money that their labor produces. And most Americans fail to adequately comprehend that in order to be able to effectively function in the modern United States, most Americans must give a very large percentage of the small amount of money that Americans earn from the rich right back to the rich through rent payments, mortgage payments, interest payments, fees, medical payments, food payments, utility payments, transportation payments, communication payments, education payments, insurance payments, legal payments, and taxes that eventually end up in rich people's bank accounts. It's well worth noting that in 2020, the closest year for which I could easily find statistics, the poorest 50% of Americans, i.e. the poorest 165 million Americans, had a lower cumulative net worth than the cumulative net worth of America's 59 richest people. Again, that's 165 million lower than 59. Said another way, in 2020, the average one person among America's 59 richest people was worth approximately as much as the average 2.8 million Americans among the poorest 50% of Americans. Again, that's 1 versus 2.8 million. Okay, and that's not even the scariest statistic that I'm going to share in this section. The scariest statistic that I'm going to share in this section is that in 2020, America's richest 1% had a cumulative net worth that was approximately 16 times as high as the cumulative net worth of America's poorest 50%. Yes, you heard that right. The top 1% are worth approximately 16 times as much as the bottom 50%. Said another way, the average member of the top 1% is worth approximately as much as the average 800 members of the bottom 50%. So, again, 1 versus 800. Okay. So the next time that you're working like a slave, remember that you're almost certainly making much more money for some already very rich person than you are for yourself and your family. I should say that again because that's important. The next time that you're working like a slave, remember that you're almost certainly making much more money for some already very rich person than you are for yourself and your family. If you work for Elon Musk, remember that he almost certainly has a net worth that's fantastically much higher than all of his employees combined. And you don't have to take my word for that. You can ask him. You know, you will get fired, obviously, but you were going to get fired anyway. You were going to get replaced by a robot or something. So yeah, go ahead and ask him if he's worth fantastically more than all of his employees combined, all of you combined, and ask him if that's fair. and ask him if it's not fair, what he intends to do about it. And most importantly, ask yourself what you intend to do about it, because I don't guess he's going to do much. So it's going to have to be you. Anyway, it's important to understand that America's leaders figured out a long time ago that you can usually get better results from a whisper than a whip. That is to say that you can usually get people to do what you want them to do more easily by whispering lies into their ears than you can by whipping their backs. America's leaders figured out a long time ago that Americans do much better work and are far more productive if Americans are enthusiastic about their work. And America's leaders figured out a long time ago that Americans are much more enthusiastic about their work if Americans are tricked into believing that Americans are working primarily to benefit themselves and their own families. Americans would certainly be fantastically much less enthusiastic about their work and fantastically much less productive if Americans ever realized that they're working primarily to make already very rich people even richer. So, America's leaders continuously condition Americans to believe that Americans are working primarily for Americans' own benefit, while studiously concealing the fact that Americans are actually working primarily to further enrich the very rich. Americans should be extraordinarily angry about the almost unfathomably pervasive, perpetual exploitation of the American people. But Americans are deliberately conditioned to be angrier about petty controversies and about their favorite team getting robbed because a referee made a bad call, and about their favorite celebrity getting voted off Dancing with the Stars, than about the very extensive, completely unnecessary, unforgivably unjust exploitation and consequent suffering of the American people that is being perpetrated by America's leaders. All right, I'm just about ready to wrap this video up, but before I do, I wanted to quickly make the point that although I keep name-checking Elon Musk, it doesn't actually or only have to be Elon Musk that does the things that I advocate in my videos. Anyone with the capability to do those things should do those things. Bill Gates and or Warren Buffett, on the off chance that you're watching this video and on the off chance that you want to do something that will actually make the world a better place instead of just making you feel better about yourself, you should do the things that I advocate in my videos. And the same goes for all of you other billionaires who obviously have more money than sense. Anyway, whoever you are, billionaire or otherwise, thanks for watching, and please like, subscribe, comment, and share.